The 2024 Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International says that Zambia has improved its score from 37 to 39 in that year. Zambia has also improved its ranking by 6 places, from 98 to 96 out of 180 countries that were monitored by Transparency International Zambia. In itself, this suggests that Zambia's fight against corruption should be improving. But is this really the case? This is what we'll talk about on this edition of This Day. Later on, we'll talk about the Bank of Zambia's decision to overhaul the current currency and an introduction of 2 higher notes, a 200 and 500 kwacha note. What is the impact of this on the Zambian economy? We'll talk about this on This Day. Welcome. My name is Dingindaba Jonah Buyoi. Tamika Halwindi, TIZ Climate Change and Environmental Sustainability Coordinator. Thank you so much for joining me on this edition of This Day. Let's start off, first of all, by understanding the process that Transparency International follows to determine these rankings.
Yes, sure. That is a very good question because it's very important to get it right in terms of the methodology that is used to compile. And I use the word compile, and I'll explain why, the Corruption Perceptions Index, and also differentiate between what we call a CPI score and the rank on the CPI. So viewers would be interested to note that TIZ does not actively participate in conducting or compiling the Corruption Perceptions Index. This is something that is done at a global level through Transparency International in Berlin, their research team. And they use several sources to compile the Corruption Perception Index. So they target a number of sources or surveys, 13 to be exact. Surveys done, for instance, by the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, and other reputable think tanks and researchers, and they get those surveys, particularly looking at questions or surveys that look at issues to do with governance, transparency, accountability, and the like. And so they refer to these different surveys or sources and look at the scores given in those assessments. And then there is a process where they standardize those scores because the different surveys use different methodologies and ranking and scoring. So what Transparency International does globally is standardize those scores to make them comparable and then interpretable through what we call the Corruption Perceptions Index. So the CPI uses a score of 0 to 100. So the standardizing process is to align the different survey and external sources used to compile the CPI into those scores. And then we have a weighted average for each country. So for instance, if a country is using 10 sources, those sources are standardized, and then we get a weighted average, and the average score is what the CPI is derived for that particular year. So in the case of Zambia this year, we saw that our score improved by 2 points. And of course, knowing that with a rank of 0 to 100, with 100 being the top mark that a country can get, we are not even halfway there, but we did make that 2-point improvement. In addition to the ranking, in addition to the scoring is now the actual rank. Currently, the CPI scores 180 countries and territories. But what is more important for us as TI and Transparency International Zambia, we really emphasize that the score is more important than the rank. So the score would be, for instance, in school is the mark that you get. For instance, grade 9, let's say you get 512. That is your score. That is the substance. The rank is very comparative and depends on other people's performance or other countries' performance in this case. So for instance, if countries if a lot of countries perform well that year, you can see that your rank might remain the same or reduce. But if countries perform worse than your country, your rank can improve. So I would say the score is a substance of the CPI, and typically that's what we encourage countries to focus on as opposed to the ranking. And so in a nutshell, we do not compile, but this is compiled, of course, by Transparency International globally, a movement of which we are part of. And where we do come in is at the point of trying to understand the results and also analyze and interpret particular results for Zambia before launching the report.
Now, as a country, we've moved from a score of 37 to 39, an improvement of 2 points. Should we truly celebrate this?
Yes, thanks, Jonah, for that question. So this is a very interesting conversation to be having right now, and really it just depends on where your perspective, when you look at the fight against corruption, your perspective as government or as civil society or even as a citizen. And I think that is the beauty of the CPIs. It gives us evidence and research to have this conversation around whether we're making progress or not in the fight against corruption. But to help answer your question, let me just hit you with some numbers and figures. So the CPI scores countries 0 to 100. So 50 would be the average mark. If you're in class, 50 is the score that you want to get, or most ambitious students, assume you and I, would want to be way above 50. Currently, our score is 39. The global average CPI score, looking at all the countries globally this year, is 43, or was 43 since it was compiled in 2024. And we are still below that global average. So that this would be like the class average, and we're below that. For Sub-Saharan Africa as a region, it had the lowest regional average score, which was 33. So at least we are above that regional average. So all this is to say that as TIZ, we acknowledge and commend the efforts made by government so far. You will recall that last year, the 2023 CPI showed that we had moved from 33 to 37 because we had stagnated at 33 for a number of years. So that was an encouraging marker of progress. And then, of course, this year with a 2-point increment. So we are still cautious because we have so much ground to cover in terms of the CPI, and there's so much that we can do as Zambia in terms of the fight against corruption and making progress thereof. One of the things that we did in our analysis and when we compiled the specific Zambia highlight report is also look at and compare performance at a regional level. Countries who we can compare with or to that are performing seemingly well, better than us on the CPI. So for instance, in the 2024 CPI, South Africa and Tanzania both have scores of 41 out of 100. We saw Botswana's score reduce, and there's a conversation to be had about why that's happening for the country, but they've typically been a top performer, but they've been declining in the last 2 years. So they now have a score of 57 over 100. Rwanda has gained some momentum and progress in the fight against corruption. They are at 57 in the 2024 CPI. So this is just to highlight comparatively how other countries, perhaps that we can compare ourselves to in terms of governance, stability, economic-wise, and aspire to such levels. There's so much room for improvement. I think that for me personally, the increment could be an indication that some things are being done right. It's incremental change, but it's not for us to now put aside our efforts, but it's actually to now dig in our heels and actually push for more progress and an improved CPI score or scores in future iterations of the Corruption Perception Index.
You have credited the government for reforms like digitization and strengthened procurement requirements and improving the CPI score. However, Critics argue that corruption remains rampant, particularly in high-profile cases. Do you believe these reforms are genuinely effective, or are they just superficial changes?
Um, yes, interesting question there. Um, the way to think about governance and even anti-corruption efforts is to look at it in terms of process. So even as an institution, an organization that's working in the space, when we are trying to measure whether our work makes any sense or we are making a difference, we have to look at it historically, presently, and try and plot what do we want to see for the future. So when it comes to governance, every reform counts, in the same way that any sort of regression counts, right? So there's a lot that needs to be done in changing and reforming the governance system in our country. And there are incremental changes that have been made. So we would call this, for instance, milestones. And the issue of digitization and really trying to strengthen procurement, because that has been a weakness. One of the things that we note as Transparency International Zambia in our research, including through the Zambia Bribe Payers Index research, which we will be launching this coming month, is that the human interaction, where you have to interact with government officials face to face, increases the risks of bribery, which is a corrupt act. So removing that interface through systems and digitization helps to reduce that risk, and goes a long way in terms of reform and changing system and removing temptation essentially from people. The same can be said for procurement. A lot of our public resources are subject to public procurement for us to get the goods and the services that we need. We have seen iterations after iterations of audit reports that have pointed to some of the issues and really revenue leakages, abuses, misuse. And so reforming that as well would go a long way. And we've seen some efforts by government to do so. The issues are in the justice system also contribute to fight against corruption. And here, even when you read our highlights report, there's a lot of room for improvement in ensuring that even as the government undertakes these reforms, working, of course, with the different partners and stakeholders and cooperating partners, that they are holistic in their approach. So I wouldn't say that any reform is artificial per se, or superficial rather, but the government needs to employ a more holistic approach, and they should be able to interrogate even some of the reforms that make them uncomfortable. I think that is one of the room for improvements that we have as a country, particularly when you look at these high profile cases. If you recall, some time back, Anti-Corruption Commission came to us as the public and said, look, we're investigating some of our sitting ministers, but we did not hear feedback in terms of whether those cases have progressed or whatever. So that is room for improvement to show and really inspire confidence in the public that they're being holistic in their approach to address corruption, both past and present, regardless of who might be involved or implicated in those cases.
Now, how would you assess the government's commitment to fighting corruption, given the concerns that political will is often selective when prosecuting corruption cases?
Is government's commitment to fighting corruption selective? Again, this is a huge debate. We have seen, and the evidence shows this, media articles show this. I think this information is in the public domain. If you analyze and you track the cases when it comes to corruption, it does seem that there is more focus on previous or past corruption that was committed in the past regime. And we would want to see, by extension, the same approach and vigor for current cases or suspected cases of corruption. As I said previously, the Anti-Corruption Commission publicly say that they were investigating high-profile cases currently of corruption, but we haven't heard anything since. And we would want really from the top. We've seen some political will and a rededication of that political will, I think, recently this year, when the president was addressing the diplomatic corps. And so we would want to see a situation where we are not able to differentiate corruption. For instance, we want to say this is the corruption that happened in this regime, or this corruption happened in regime B, but we want a scenario where we see a fair anti-corruption fight, including fairness in how cases are investigated and prosecuted. I think one of the things that this administration and the president said initially when they came into power was that there would be no sacred cows in the fight against corruption. Currently, there is a perception that there are some people who might be untouchable for whatever reason. And so we would want, as TIZ, would want an extent where we also see high profile suspected cases of corruption, because they are there. I'm sure there are reports to the ACC as well as ourselves and other scandals that have raised suspicion in the public for those to be investigated and followed up with the same vigor as previous instances of corruption and abuse of office.
Do you have confidence in the current ACC to fight past, present, and future corruption?
Like I said, it's, the fight against corruption is a journey and a process. If you look at countries that are seemingly winning the fight, and of course, winning is very relative, they have been very consistent. And this is something that we urge government, but also citizens to do, to be very consistent in the fight against corruption, but also to be patient but not complacent in the fight against corruption. I think one of the things that seems to be unfortunate, as I indicated, we have seen an acceleration and so much effort going into what was done previously in terms of abuse of office, issues to do with embezzlement and corruption, which is fine because corruption, key anti-corruption activists emphasize that corruption is not a victimless crime, and people should be brought to book, and there should be justice and restitution. And we've seen the government putting in place measures, for instance, to even fast track some of these cases through the Economic and Financial Crimes Court. What might be missing at the moment, I think, is also investigating and looking into high-profile corruption cases that are currently happening. And there are indications of this if you look at the Auditor General reports since this government came into administration. If you look at the Financial Intelligence Center reports, I mean, there are indications that not everything is going as it should, and it would be good to get an indication of what the government is doing about this current corrupt acts or embezzlement acts and the investigations underway, because I think what has been publicized so much is what the government is doing to redress what was done previously. And so it does sometimes send the wrong signal that the government might not want to send to the citizens and stakeholders in terms of their approach to fight against corruption. But as I said, and even through our launch, because we launched this report yesterday, we have seen some political will and resolve from the top and the law enforcement agencies and relevant ministries to fight against corruption. I think it's just putting that will to work, and to work very strategically to ensure that we make gains in the fight against corruption, and hopefully that this will be shown and demonstrated in the future CPI score.
Your organization is urging the government to reduce allocations to the Constituency Development Fund due to revelations of underperformance and governance weaknesses in the program. Do you think the right approach should be to address these, don't you think rather that the right approach should be to address these bottlenecks rather than reducing the allocation on the Constituency Development Fund?
Yes, very interesting question there, Jonah. And again, another topic that is up for debate and conversation. As TIZ, we did an analysis of the recent report from the Auditor General that was focusing on the Constituency Development Fund. We will be releasing that report shortly, but from the analysis, we must say that we have concerns highlighted in that report in terms of CDF and CDF as a mechanism. And so our argument comes from, if, for instance, you have a tap or a drum that's leaking, does it make sense to continue pouring water in that drum, or would you rather just wait a minute, plug the hole or whatever leakage is, and then fill up the drum? So it's a debate of the approach, and that is our rationale. We do feel that in the case of CDF, there is reason for the government and stakeholders to take a minute and rethink some of the issues that are coming up when you look at the report from the Auditor General. For instance, some of the findings speak to money being received, but projects not being completed. And this is something that, of course, we have seen time and time again in audit reports. The other interesting findings were around, people getting grants or empowerment funds, and their bank accounts not being registered to them, but to other people, for instance, someone who works at the council. Those are anomalies that need to be fixed. There is research that around corruption that looks into how, when you have high levels of public sector corruption, which in a sense we do have as Zambia. If you look at the CPI score, 39, yes, an improvement from 37, but we're not there yet in terms of how we are perceived corruption-wise. So when you have a corruption problem in a centralized system, which we had at Zambia, and then you begin to decentralize, the risk is that you're also decentralizing corruption. And so I think there's time for government and stakeholders involved to rethink and see how some of the issues and bottlenecks can be resolved, as opposed to just piling on, all this money, and some councils don't even have the capacity to spend that money, and all these corruption risks that are being worsened and aggravated and heightened because of the money involved. One of the things we have seen as Transparency International as a movement, but as TIZ, and we saw this during COVID, is where there's lots of money involved, corrupt actors are attracted immediately. And so you have to ensure that you have strategies to mitigate leakage, because at the end of the day, these funds are supposed to be for local development and benefit communities and vulnerable people. But if they're being lost, if the bulk of it is being lost in translation somewhere because of corruption and corrupt actors, it doesn't matter how much you put in the fund. What matters is what is the benefit for communities. So I think that the whole reason for CDF is not to enrich corrupt individuals, but rather to empower communities. And that, if that's the case, then I think the government has to work tirelessly to redress some of those issues and bottlenecks in the CDF mechanism before they increase and increase and increase further, because otherwise they're just increasing the opportunities for leakage, I would say.
Thank you for talking to us on this edition of This Day. You're watching This Day. We'll take a break. When we come back, we talk about the Bank of Zambia's introduction of new notes onto the market and the effects that this will have on the Zambian economy. Welcome back. You're watching This Day. Kelvin Chisanga, an economist, you're joining me on This Day to talk about this, but let's start off first of all with your sentiments. Does the introduction of the 500 kwacha note signal a failure in controlling inflation, and could it be seen as an admission that the kwacha is losing value?
Okay, so the beginning point is we are trying to curb inflation, and obviously looking at the current situation regarding the 100 kwacha note as an existing model of banknote has made a lot of erosion in its effect, meaning the purchasing power has really gone a bit low, and that is the reason why we are trying now to see what models we can use. So the issue of coming up with a 500 kwacha banknote or bill is basically just going to cement some of the challenges. And again, also, it's coming from the background where we had a situation where our law notes were not actually in circulation. And that now we speak, we do not have so much in circulation. And that also makes the transaction cycle a little bit more difficult. Now, making a replacement of those small notes might be meaning to be more expensive compared to having the notes, bigger notes as it stands right now. So what we are seeing on the table is that it's an act of balance that has been instituted so far to make sure that we have higher notes as well as a small complementary part of smaller notes in this case. And also the security features that are actually being enhanced also is what has augmented to what we are seeing today.
With the Bank of Zambia raising the MPR to 14.5%, borrowing is going to become more expensive. Won't this slow down economic growth at a time when businesses are already struggling?
Well, we understand that the implication that comes with the increment or the rising of monetary policy rate is quite direct. It's issues that borders on the credit basket, and also it goes further to disturb the market pattern in terms of the overall economic activities, where we'll be able to see that the reduction will be taking place in most of production as well as consumption levels. So definitely, with the aspect of rising the MPR, it's a matter of delicate balance which need to be worked there. And what we see on the side, especially on the fiscal side of the budget, we've seen that it still remains quite upbeat, where it has maintained a level of expansionary. So the Bank of Zambia is trying to make that balance act in this place. So yes, we understand the aspect of credit basket being tightened, but again, also it makes a lot of other things much easier, especially trying to curb inflation, which has been escalating, running upward. So meaning what we're trying to see is that the inflation, even the forecast view, it's actually something that is quite upbeat. So to tame that and to sustain our expectation, we need to find ourselves in that category of going upward. So it has been triggered with the 0.5%, which translate to about a 50 basis point, meaning even when it comes to the increment of financial solution will be triggered by that factor.
There's already a risk that larger banknotes could lead to price rounding and inflationary pressures. How does the Bank of Zambia plan to prevent businesses from using this as an excuse to increase prices?
Okay, so the overall factor we're able to see here is quite significant and fundamental component, because obviously what we see is that the rate of erosion that is taking place in most of our domestic currency. And if you need to look at it also vis-a-vis with the forex market, I think that justifies a bit for now. But again, also, the aspect that is taking place with the determination of the currency is something that basically has got a complex of reasoning. And the key factors here is, of course, inflation, to make sure that the macroeconomic stability is sustained from there. But what we see also in essence here is that it may be a solution to some of the problem that we see in terms of, what we're able to build in the long run. But again, the issue is that in the short run or in the short term, we should be able to see a bit of implications. But as it stands right now, we are trying to use a permanent solution to make it permanently. What we are also basically seeing is that maybe it could also be an issue that we are just basically doing this in a short time frame. But as it stands, it could have been projected to have happened with this model of currency change in the 2027 as it stands because of so many risk factors that are still standing strong in this current situation. As maybe I meant to say that we are coming from external shocks which were plaguing or making a difficult situation for Zambia in terms of its growth, meaning even the economic aspiration of growth has been hampered in a way. But with the current situation, we should be able to see that we could have grown a steady movement of certain key factors. But with the current happening where the policy now is coming in the form of a shock, it becomes a really difficult situation. And expect that we are even going toward electoral process. This demands that maybe we could have waited a bit longer for us to implement this process.
Well, maybe let me ask it this way. The psychology of money, as others would call it, would suggest that the introduction of a 200 kwacha, 500 kwacha note onto the market could lead to some businesses increasing their prices because there's a large note available on the market. Should we expect this?
Okay, yes, that is something that I would say, yeah, it's a bad effect that will be psychologically brought on the board because what we'll be able to see that the highest note has to command some units of value from the business activities, meaning what we'll be able to see in the near future as we get to some place there, we'll be able to see that an item will cost almost exactly that largest bill. And this now basically also derail the planning that we have put in place. And that also brings about inflation in some way as well. But what we see as going forward as well is that this can also lead to rebasing in near future. But again, the gist of the matter here is that we have reached a point where we are fighting a very aggressive ingredient of bad effect, which is actually inflation here. So we are trying to make sure that we putting a very good balancing, will into this matter. And that is the reason why maybe this has come to the fore. Though, as I mentioned, it's not something that we should have lashed, but again, it's something that maybe with a lot of conscious and decisions around this, we'll be able to see how we can drive the economic factors from there.
Should people be worried about this decision by the Bank of Zambia and the government to introduce fresh notes and overhaul of notes on the market, but also introduce 2 new higher notes? Should people be worried?
Yes, the biggest anxiety coming there, it's the timing which has been given. It's a bit of a short notice in essence. And also the biggest factor is that it has just flashed in the back. This could have been an aspect which should have involved with the stakeholders consultation process of a model of decision, or maybe it could have worked out with a lot of involvement of key players in the sectors such as agriculture, mining, and all those that we have actually identified as critical sectors that we actually count on for us to make up that aggregate demand in the country. So maybe the basis here is that it has been triggered without expectations. Obviously, if we are expecting it from last year or any other time, we should have been able to see this coming. But the time frame that is being given for it to start implementations and also for it to process all what we need to see basically is what is actually giving even people that anxiety. And that is right now. It creates also an aspect of psychological effect in terms of projection for investment, meaning even when you look at the business process and the involvement of different factors around financial source, it actually gives a number of questions as well. So what we see on the table is maybe the appeal that should be able to work out for us to see that this works in a better way. And there must be a proper communication model which should be able to educate and create that awareness in the public domain. So that even when we start making use of these notes, it should be accepted with the full faith that it promises on demand.
Now, how do we justify printing new high-value notes when Zambia is trying to push for a digital and cashless economy? Does this contradict financial inclusion efforts?
Well, the aspect of financial diversity is one biggest element sitting right in the center, and also the aspiration to push for financial technology as being one of the biggest factor which has been, on the agenda to develop financial knowledge. And of course, maybe that's the more reason why there is even a bit of a jump to have a 500 note bill, and also the other 200, owing because that we need to maybe to transact more using the other models of transaction like mobile money, other network that should be able to work out from there. Because what we see is that ever since the establishment of the national switch in 2014, we have not been able to see that in financial inclusion, or financial part of inclusion is taking that rapid growth, except the time when we had COVID. We saw how technological aspect were made from there, meaning the technological formation and advancement in terms of using technology as a means of channeling money and other financial resources has basically taken up from there. So meaning even right now, as we speak, we are talking of trying to make that as a good mixture into what we do around business activities. So I believe strongly that maybe even the printing of money won't be so much as compared to what we have done in the past, because we are trying to embrace the financial technology as a key factor to actually interplay with it as well.
Kelvin Sanga, thank you so much for joining me on this edition of This Day.
My pleasure. Thank you.